Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. When we think about religion, we usually picture something comforting, something that gives people purpose, community, and hope. But what if I told you that some of the same patterns we see in mental disorders also show up in religious belief? Not in an obvious way, not in a way that makes the comparison easy to dismiss as insulting or exaggerated, but in subtle ways that are worth examining if we care about how the human mind works. Start with this question: what does it mean to call something a mental illness? It usually involves persistent beliefs that don't match reality, thoughts that resist correction even when clear evidence is presented, behaviors that can cause harm to oneself or others, sometimes under the illusion of doing something good. Does any of that sound familiar when we look at religion? Maybe more than we're comfortable admitting. The human brain didn't evolve for truth, it evolved for survival. We latch on to patterns, even when they're not real, because it once helped us avoid danger. If the bushes moved, better to assume a predator than to do nothing. Over time, this pattern seeking became so strong that we now see intention where there is none. We imagine a mind behind random events, a designer behind chaos. That's the psychological seed that grew into gods. And once a belief like that takes hold, it behaves differently from ordinary ideas. It becomes resistant, sticky. It rewrites your sense of reality to fit itself. And that's where the parallel to mental illness begins. Think about what psychiatrists call delusional thinking. It doesn't mean someone is unintelligent or irrational in every area of life. A person can be highly functional and still hold beliefs that defy evidence. If someone said, "An invisible being watches me every second and judges everything I do," outside of a religious setting, we'd consider it a symptom. If they claim this being rewards obedience with eternal life and punishes disobedience with endless suffering, we'd see that as extreme. Yet, when these ideas are packaged in tradition and shared by millions, we stop questioning them. Social acceptance changes the label, not the nature of the belief. This isn't about ridicule, it's about asking why beliefs that mirror symptoms of certain disorders are treated as sacred rather than pathological. Schizophrenia often involves hearing voices or feeling guided by an unseen force. Religious experience sometimes sounds exactly like that. Visions, prophecies, divine commands. In any other context, those would trigger concern, even medical intervention. But attach the word holy, and suddenly it's celebrated. Of course, the difference people point out is harm. Mental illness is defined partly by the distress or dysfunction it causes. Religion, many argue, does the opposite. It gives comfort, reduces anxiety, creates social bonds. And yes, that can be true. But here's the twist. Many harmful coping mechanisms also provide relief. Addictive drugs calm anxiety too, at least at first. That doesn't make them healthy. If a belief requires denying reality, suppressing curiosity, or fostering guilt and fear just to function, is that really a net positive? Or is it a beautiful prison that feels safe because you've stopped checking for exits? The more you dig, the more you notice how these systems enforce themselves. Doubt isn't treated as healthy skepticism. It's labeled as weakness, sin, even moral failure. Imagine telling a psychiatrist that questioning your thoughts means you're evil. That's not therapy. That's entrapment. And the cycle reinforces itself. The harder you question, the more guilt you feel, which pushes you deeper into the very system causing the guilt. Perfect loop. That kind of cognitive trap is almost textbook in some anxiety disorders. Then there's the control element. Many mental illnesses hijack normal emotional processes, fear, guilt, reward, and amplify them in unhealthy ways. Religion does something similar by binding morality to cosmic consequences. Every choice becomes a step toward paradise or punishment. This isn't just about personal comfort, it's about systemic pressure on the psyche. It hardwires fear into identity. When you believe eternal torment is possible for the smallest misstep, you live in a state of chronic stress, even if it feels normal because everyone around you shares it. So, is religion a mental illness in disguise? That might sound provocative, maybe unfair, but the parallels aren't imaginary. they're rooted in how the brain creates and sustains belief. And if we're serious about mental health, about understanding why humans cling to certain ideas even when they clash with reality, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. Some will argue that religion can't be compared to mental illness because it's a cultural phenomenon, a shared framework of meaning, not an individual disorder. And yes, culture does play a huge role, but does social acceptance really make something rational or healthy? If an entire community shared the same paranoid belief, say that invisible demons were plotting against them, would that belief stop being pathological just because it's popular? Scale doesn't equal sanity. If anything, it makes the illusion harder to challenge because now it feels normal. Anthropologists often describe religion as an adaptive mechanism. It bonded groups, created cooperation, gave tribes an identity. And that's true, but so did warfare. So does xenophobia. Evolutionary advantage doesn't equal moral or psychological value. What helped us survive in small groups on the savannah might not be serving us in a world where we understand physics, biology, and the cosmos. Clinging to these outdated cognitive scripts can create a deep dissonance between what we know and what we believe. And living with constant dissonance is stressful, even if it's buried under rituals and repetition. Here's where it gets more interesting. Cognitive science has studied something called hyperactive agency detection. It's the tendency to assume that events have an intentional cause, especially when the cause isn't obvious. That's why people pray during storms, thank the universe for good luck, or feel cursed when something goes wrong. It's the same mental bias that makes a child think the wind is angry because it blew away their toy. We expect this in kids, but religion institutionalizes it in adults, and the rituals, prayers, and sacred texts reinforce the illusion over a lifetime. This doesn't mean believers are foolish. It means the brain is vulnerable. Our neural hardware is ancient, optimized for pattern recognition, not truth-seeking. Religion exploits that vulnerability like a software virus running on outdated code. Once installed, it rewrites priorities, obedience over inquiry, certainty over curiosity. And because it promises something priceless, eternal life, ultimate justice, the cost-benefit calculation feels impossible to challenge. No wonder it resists correction. Who wants to risk infinite loss? Now think about obsessive-compulsive disorder. One of its hallmarks is ritual. Repeated actions to reduce anxiety caused by intrusive thoughts. Hand-washing, checking locks, counting steps. It's all about control in the face of uncertainty. Does that sound familiar? Religious rituals serve a similar function. Praying a certain way, fasting on certain days, repeating words with perfect precision. The anxiety here isn't germs or safety, it's divine judgment. Miss a prayer, break a rule, and the punishment isn't small, it's infinite. That's an impossible weight to carry, so rituals become non-negotiable coping mechanisms. There's also the question of hallucinations and visions. Some of the most celebrated figures in religious history, prophets, saints, mystics, described experiences that today would likely meet clinical criteria for psychosis. Hearing voices no one else can hear, seeing beings others can't see, feeling controlled by a higher power. In a hospital, those are red flags. In a temple, they're proof of holiness. And the irony is that both believers and clinicians respond with compassion, but only one of them calls it what it is. What about the moral dimension? Many people claim religion makes us better, more ethical, more compassionate. But look closely. Is morality coming from reason and empathy, or from fear of punishment and hope of reward? If a person avoids harming others only because they think a supernatural judge is watching, that's not morality, that's compliance. It's like a child behaving only because they fear a parent's anger, not because they understand why hitting someone is wrong. Genuine ethics grows from understanding harm, not fearing hell. Now here's where the comparison to mental illness becomes more nuanced. Mental disorders often reduce a person's ability to adapt to reality. They create rigid patterns of thought that block growth. Religion can do the same. It locks people into cognitive boxes where questioning is forbidden, where answers must come from authority, never from evidence. That's why so many scientific breakthroughs were fought tooth and nail by religious institutions, not because truth was unclear, but because dogma was immovable. The more rigid the system, the more fragile it becomes when reality pushes back. But isn't there a difference between a private delusion and a collective one? Sure, but the effects on behavior can be just as powerful, sometimes worse. History is full of atrocities fueled by beliefs in divine mandates, wars, inquisitions, genocides, all justified by convictions no evidence could shake. It's not just unhealthy for individuals, it's catastrophic for civilizations. And what's chilling is how often those acts were done by people convinced they were virtuous. That's the danger of any belief immune to evidence. It turns certainty into a weapon. The modern world offers endless examples: faith healers convincing people to abandon medical treatment, parents refusing life-saving care for their children because of God's will, leaders claiming disasters are punishment for sins. If an individual did these things based on private voices in their head, we'd call it pathological. When it's done in the name of religion, we call it faith. Does the label change the underlying psychology, or does it just sanitize it for social comfort? So if the parallels are so strong, why does this question make people so uncomfortable? Maybe because it threatens identity. Religion isn't just a belief system, it's a lens through which millions see the world. Challenging it feels like an attack on selfhood, family, even purpose. And humans are wired to defend identity more fiercely than almost anything. Which is exactly why, if religion is a kind of cultural mental illness, it's the most adaptive one ever. It survives by binding itself to the very thing we fear losing the most: meaning. One of the strongest defenses people offer for religion is its emotional payoff. They'll say it brings peace, gives life meaning, helps people cope with death. And yes, that's often true. But the same could be said for many illusions. Comfort doesn't make something true. In fact, the more comforting an idea is, the more suspicious we should be of its truth, because our brains are biased toward anything that reduces anxiety. It's like a placebo for existential dread. And like any placebo, it can mask symptoms without addressing the underlying reality. Take death, for example. Every religion promises a way to defeat it: resurrection, reincarnation, eternal bliss. These promises work because they target our deepest fear. Without them, we're forced to face the terrifying possibility that life ends completely, that everything we are dissolves into nothing. That's hard to accept, no doubt. But is the alternative, believing without evidence in a fantasy reward, really a sign of mental health? Or is it denial dressed in ritual and scripture? Psychologists call this terror management theory, the idea that much of human culture, including religion, is built to buffer against the fear of death. It's why symbols of immortality are everywhere, from pyramids to cathedrals to tombstones. This coping mechanism might reduce anxiety in the short term, but it can also lead to destructive behaviors. When people feel their worldview threatened, they cling harder to it, and history shows us what happens when billions of people cling to incompatible stories about the ultimate meaning of life. Conflict isn't a bug, it's a feature of competing illusions. And let's talk about something else that doesn't get discussed enough: guilt. Many mental health disorders involve excessive, irrational guilt. People blame themselves for things beyond their control, feel unworthy, or obsess over minor mistakes. Religion institutionalizes that feeling. The idea of original sin is a perfect example. You're guilty before you even exist. You owe a debt you can never fully repay. Every thought, every desire is monitored, and if it strays from the rule book, you're condemned. This isn't healthy accountability. It's engineered shame, and when shame becomes part of identity, it's incredibly hard to break free. Think about the language used in sermons, prayers, sacred texts. Phrases like broken, unclean, unworthy. Repeating those words week after week rewires your self-image. It's cognitive conditioning. Psychologists know that repeated negative self-talk reinforces depression and anxiety. Yet entire traditions are built on getting people to internalize their smallness and helplessness. Why? Because a person who feels powerless is easier to control. That's not just unhealthy, it's manipulative. And then there's the obsession with purity, avoiding unclean foods, staying away from certain people, following elaborate rules to remain acceptable in the eyes of a deity. Compare that to what clinicians call scrupulosity, a subtype of obsessive-compulsive disorder. People with scrupulosity become consumed by fears of moral or religious failure. They pray excessively, confess constantly, avoid anything that might trigger guilt. The difference between pathological scrupulosity and mainstream religious devotion is often just degree, not kind. Both are driven by fear of punishment and a desperate need for reassurance. What about prophecy and apocalyptic thinking? Throughout history, countless religious movements have predicted the end of the world. Set dates, build entire communities around the expectation of a final judgment. And when the prophecy fails, as it always does, followers don't abandon the belief, they rationalize it, reinterpret it, double down. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance reduction. The same mechanism that keeps someone in a harmful relationship keeps someone in a failed prophecy cult. Admitting error would shatter the entire belief system, so the mind twists reality to protect the illusion. That's not faith. That's a defense mechanism on overdrive. Now, to be fair, not every believer experiences these extremes. Many people live balanced lives while holding religious beliefs. But the structure of those beliefs, the demand for absolute certainty, the fear of eternal consequences, the suppression of doubt, creates fertile ground for the same cognitive distortions seen in mental disorders. It's a spectrum, and religion normalizes the lower end of that spectrum so thoroughly that we stop noticing how strange it actually is. Here's something rarely acknowledged. Mental health professionals have historically tiptoed around religion, partly out of respect for cultural sensitivity, partly out of fear of backlash. But that hesitation leaves a blind spot in understanding how belief systems shape mental well-being. When someone says, "God told me to do this," clinicians often hesitate to challenge it if the belief is socially sanctioned. Yet the risk is real. People have killed, starved, or mutilated themselves because of divine commands. If those behaviors came from any other source, we'd intervene immediately. And here's the final twist. If religion is a socially acceptable delusion, then breaking free from it isn't just an intellectual act. It's an act of psychological courage. It means facing mortality without anesthesia, living without cosmic guarantees, taking full responsibility for meaning instead of outsourcing it to a sacred text. That's not easy, but mental health has never been about comfort at any cost. It's about facing reality as it is and learning to thrive anyway. Why does religion persist if the parallels to mental illness are so strong? Why haven't we collectively outgrown it the way we outgrew belief in witches or bloodletting? The answer is simple and complicated at the same time. Religion hacks into our deepest psychological needs, the ones evolution hardwired long before reason came along. First, the need for control. Life is unpredictable. Disease, disaster, death, all out of our hands. That uncertainty terrifies us, so we invent a story where someone's in charge. A father figure, a cosmic judge, a loving shepherd. That illusion of control soothes the fear of chaos. And that's exactly how anxiety disorders work. The mind tries to impose control through compulsions or rigid rules. Religion just scales it up into a system. Second, the need for belonging. Humans are social to the core. We survive by sticking together, and nothing bonds people faster than a shared belief, especially one that says outsiders are dangerous. Religion doesn't just offer friendship, it offers identity, ritual, and a sense of being chosen. And walking away from that is brutal. It feels like exile. That's why so many people stay, even after their doubts pile up. It's not about the truth anymore. It's about losing your tribe. Third, the need for meaning. A meaningless universe feels intolerable. We crave purpose like we crave food. Religion serves it on a silver platter. You're here for a reason. Your life matters infinitely, and every struggle is part of a grand design. It's intoxicating because the alternative, that meaning is something we create, not receive, demands effort, creativity, and the courage to live without guarantees. For many, that feels unbearable. This triple payoff, control, belonging, meaning, makes religion incredibly resilient, even when evidence shreds its claims. The emotional safety net keeps people tethered. That's why arguments about facts rarely work. You can show 1,000 contradictions in scripture and it won't matter. Because what you're really threatening isn't a text. It's a coping mechanism. Now let's ground this in some real-world consequences. Look at cases where faith collides with reality and you'll see how dangerous these illusions can be. Parents refusing chemotherapy for a child because they believe prayer will heal them. People rejecting vaccines because they think divine protection is enough. Women dying in childbirth because the doctrine forbids certain medical interventions. These aren't fringe cases. They happen globally, every year. And each time, the underlying logic is the same. I know what reality says, but my belief says otherwise. That's the essence of delusion. And it's not just physical harm. Religion shapes mental landscapes in ways that can be deeply damaging. LGBTQ people taught they're broken or sinful. Women told their worth is submission. Children terrified of eternal torture for asking the wrong questions. These are not rare stories. They're systemic outcomes of doctrines designed to control. And when someone finally escapes that system, the recovery often looks like therapy, because it is. Unlearning fear, rebuilding self-worth, relearning how to trust reason. That's not a casual transition, it's psychological rehab. But here's something even more revealing. When religions fracture, when new denominations form, what's the most common reason? Disagreement over doctrine, yes, but deeper than that, anxiety about purity and control. Someone thinks the group isn't strict enough, or it's too strict. So they create a new set of rules to feel secure again. It's the same compulsive cycle we see in OCD, endlessly adjusting rituals to keep the fear at bay, only now it's scaled up to entire communities. If all this sounds grim, here's the good news. Humans can outgrow illusions, not by erasing our needs, but by meeting them honestly. That's the key. If religion collapses, something has to fill the void, or people will just invent new dogmas. Political, ideological, even conspiratorial. We're seeing it already. When one rigid system falls, another often rises because the underlying hunger for certainty hasn't gone away. So the challenge isn't just saying religion is false, it's building ways to satisfy those needs without bending reality. Can we create belonging without tribalism? Can we find meaning without magical thinking? Can we face death without sugarcoating it? Those are the real questions. And they're harder than they sound because they require what religion never taught us: intellectual humility, emotional resilience, and the courage to live without guarantees. So, is religion a mental illness in disguise? Maybe that's too simplistic, but the parallels are undeniable. It mimics the structures of obsessive fear, delusional certainty, and compulsive ritual. It enforces patterns that disconnect people from reality and punish attempts to break free. And it thrives not because it's true, but because it exploits the same vulnerabilities that mental disorders exploit. The only difference is that one gets treated while the other gets tax exemptions and cathedrals. And if that makes us uncomfortable, maybe that's the point. Maybe progress begins the moment we admit that comfort isn't the same as health, and tradition isn't the same as truth. So where does that leave us? If religion shares so many traits with mental illness, rigid thinking, resistance to evidence, compulsive behaviors, manufactured guilt, does that mean every believer is sick? Of course not. Most religious people live functional lives, just as most people with cognitive biases do. The issue isn't about individuals, it's about systems. Systems that normalize distortions of reality, reward blind obedience, and punish healthy doubt. When we call something an illness, we usually ask, does it cause harm? And religion has caused harm on scales both intimate and global. Wars fought in God's name, children scarred by doctrines that teach them they're broken, scientific progress stalled because truth threatens dogma. But the harm isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, hidden inside someone's mind. The woman who lies awake every night, fearing eternal punishment. The man who can't enjoy life because he believes suffering now earns reward later. The teenager crushed under shame for feelings they can't control. These aren't headlines, but they're real. And they're everywhere. The hardest part about questioning religion isn't logic, it's fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being alone, fear of losing the comforting illusion that someone somewhere has a plan for you. And I get it. Facing reality as it is, indifferent, unpredictable, finite, takes courage. It's raw, it's unsettling, but it's also liberating. Because when you let go of the story that someone else wrote for you, you finally get to write your own. Here's the truth no one wants to admit. Meaning isn't given. It's made. It's built in the choices we make, the relationships we nurture, the knowledge we seek. And when you understand that, you don't need invisible overseers or sacred texts to tell you how to live. You don't need to fear eternal punishment to be a good person. Empathy, reason, and shared humanity are more than enough. In fact, they're stronger than fear because they come from within, not from coercion. So, is religion a mental illness in disguise? Maybe the better question is this: why do we excuse in groups what we would treat in individuals? Why do we sanctify delusion when it's collective? And how much longer will we cling to stories that comfort us at the cost of clarity? If you've ever doubted, if you've ever felt that quiet voice saying, "This doesn't make sense," listen to it. That's not weakness, that's strength. That's the part of you that values truth over tradition, curiosity over certainty. And in the end, that might be the healthiest thing a human mind can do. Because reality, unfiltered, unsweetened, unapologetic, is still more beautiful than any illusion. And it's ours. All of it, for as long as we're here. Thanks for staying with me through this exploration. If this made you think, if it challenged you, if it unsettled you, that's good. That's the point. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens in the questions we're brave enough to ask.